3 copper pennies and a single silver button were all that stood between Abigail Weston and her sister's grave. Standing inside Montgomery's mercantile, the destitute widow trembled as the cruel shopkeeper swept her meager offering aside, loudly denying the life-saving fever medicine she begged for. A suffocating silence fell over the gawking townsfolk as she turned toward the freezing November storm, her spirit finally shattered. But before the heavy oak door could slam in her face, a broad, canvas-clad shoulder caught the frame. A towering stranger stepped inside, locked his steely gaze on the proprietor, and delivered 7 words that changed everything. The bell above the door of Montgomery's general store clanged with a harsh, brassy finality, announcing the arrival of another soul to be judged by the proprietor. Abigail Weston stepped inside, the biting chill of the 1,888 Texas winter clinging to the threadbare wool of her shawl. She kept her head bowed, her dark hair tucked hastily beneath a faded bonnet. The scent of roasted coffee beans, cured leather, and lye soap washed over her, a cruel reminder of comforts she could no longer afford. Abigail tightened her grip on her woven basket. Inside lay 3 pennies and a silver button she had cut from her late husband's Sunday coat. It was all she had left. The store was crowded. The harsh winter had driven the ranchers and townsfolk indoors, and they lingered by the potbelly stove, trading gossip and sizing up anyone who walked through the door. Mrs. Gable, the mayor's gossiping wife, paused mid-sentence, her eyes darting toward Abigail. Old Man Higgins spat tobacco juice into a brass spittoon, the ping echoing loudly in the sudden lull of conversation. They all knew why Abigail was here, and they all knew she had nothing. Behind the long mahogany counter stood Amanda Montgomery. Amanda was a hard man with eyes like polished flint and a ledger that ruled his life. He wiped his hands on a stained apron as Abigail approached, his expression souring with every step she took. "Afternoon, Mr. Montgomery," Abigail said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her throat was tight, choked with the dust of the road and the bitter pill of her own pride. "Mrs. Weston," Amanda replied, not bothering to offer a polite nod. He didn't ask how he could help her. He merely stared, waiting for the inevitable plea. I need a small sack of flour and a bottle of quinine," she managed to say, her eyes fixed on the grain of the wood counter. "My sister, Alexander. Her fever returned in the night. The chills are racking her terribly." Amanda sighed, a heavy, theatrical sound designed to draw the attention of the onlookers by the stove. He opened his massive leather-bound ledger, thumbing through the pages until he found the one bearing the name Weston. He traced a thick, calloused finger down the column of red ink. "Your husband, God rest his soul, left this world owing me $42.16, Abigail. You haven't paid a dime on this account since the mine collapsed 3 months ago." Abigail flinched at the mention of the silver mine. Arthur's death was a wound that hadn't even begun to heal, buried under the crushing weight of survival. "I know. Mr. Montgomery, I am trying to sell the remaining livestock, but the buyers are scarce. I just need the medicine. I have my silver button from Arthur's coat. It's pure silver. I swear it. And these pennies. It should cover the quinine. At least." She placed the pennies and the button on the counter. Amanda didn't even touch them. He looked at the button with outright disdain. "I run a mercantile, Mrs. Weston, not a pawn shop," Amanda said loudly, his voice carrying over the crackle of the stove. "And I don't trade in sentiment. If I start giving out charity to every widow the Blackwood Mining Company makes, I'll be out on the street myself." "Please, Amanda," Abigail begged, the tears she had sworn to hold back finally pricking at the corners of her eyes. "Alexander is burning up. Just the medicine. I'll go without the flour." "The answer is no," Amanda said, slamming the ledger shut with a sound like a gunshot. "Your credit is dry. Your collateral is worthless. I suggest you go to the church, or beg Josiah Blackwood for an advance on your land. But you will not take goods from my shelves without hard currency. Now, step aside. You're holding up paying customers." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the store. The whispers from the stove grew louder, a chorus of pity and judgment. Abigail felt the heat rising in her cheeks, a humiliating flush that burned hotter than Alexander's fever. She reached out with trembling fingers to gather her pitiful pennies and her husband's button. The room spun slightly. She was 24 years old, entirely alone in the world save for a sickly younger sister, and she was going to watch Alexander die because of a silver button. She turned to leave, her vision blurring. She took one step toward the door, feeling the collective gaze of Oakhaven burning into her back. Then, the heavy oak door swung open, letting in a gust of freezing wind and a man who seemed to carry the storm inside with him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a dusty canvas duster over a dark woolen shirt. A low-slung Stetson cast a deep shadow over his face, obscuring his eyes. But the rugged set of his jaw and the dark, day-old stubble spoke of a man who was no stranger to hard miles. Silver spurs jingled softly as he stepped into the room, boots thudding against the pine floorboards. He walked with a quiet, dangerous grace that instantly commanded the room. The whispering by the stove died completely. He stopped right beside Abigail. He smelled of leather, pine, and horse sweat, a sharp, clean scent that somehow anchored her in the spinning room. The stranger looked down at Abigail, then his gaze shifted to the tears shining in her eyes, and finally to the pennies and the silver button left abandoned on the counter. He looked up at Amanda Montgomery. "Give the lady what she asked for," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. Amanda blinked, his authoritative demeanor faltering for a fraction of a second before he puffed out his chest. "And who might you be, mister? This here is a private matter of unpaid debts." The stranger reached into his duster and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it onto the counter. It landed with a heavy, metallic thud that made Amanda jump. The stranger loosened the drawstrings, revealing the dull, unmistakable gleam of minted gold double eagles. The cowboy leaned forward, placing his large, calloused hands flat on the mahogany counter. He locked eyes with the store owner, his expression entirely unreadable, and delivered 7 words that echoed through the quiet store. "Put her supplies on my tab, Amanda." For a long moment, nobody in the general store dared to breathe. Amanda Montgomery stared at the gold coins, his throat working as he swallowed hard. The arrogance that had puffed him up just moments before deflated like a punctured lung. "Yes, sir," Amanda stammered, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the quinine bottle on the shelf behind him. He hastily grabbed a large burlap sack and began filling it not just with flour, but with coffee, sugar, salt, pork, and a tin of peaches. Abigail stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked up at the stranger. Beneath the brim of his hat, she saw striking, slate-gray eyes. They weren't cold, but they held a heavy, guarded history. A scar cut a faint white line through his left eyebrow, adding to the rugged harshness of his face. Yet when he looked down at her, the intensity softened. I can't accept this, sir," Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. "I have no way to repay you. My husband's debts." "I didn't ask for repayment, ma'am," the stranger replied softly, tipping his hat. "The name is Wyatt. Wyatt Callahan." "Abigail Weston," she breathed, entirely overwhelmed. "But Mr. Callahan, you don't understand. I am deeply in debt to the Blackwood Bank. If you pay for this, you are throwing your gold into a bottomless well." Wyatt offered a faint, fleeting smile. It didn't reach his eyes, but it transformed his face, making him devastatingly handsome for a brief second. "I've never been much for accounting, Mrs. Weston, and I don't like seeing a woman made a spectacle of by men who ought to know better." He shot a glaring look toward the men by the stove, who immediately found their boots fascinating. Amanda pushed the heavy burlap sack and the small bottle of quinine across the counter. Wyatt didn't even check the change. Amanda nervously tried to hand him. He merely scooped up the leather pouch and tied it back to his belt. He hoisted the heavy sack of supplies onto his shoulder as easily as if it were a bag of feathers. "My wagon is outside," Wyatt said. "I'll drive you home." "I walked," Abigail admitted. the flush returning to her cheeks. "My farm is 3 miles out on the ridge. I couldn't possibly ask you to—" "You didn't ask," Wyatt interrupted smoothly, placing a gentle hand on her elbow. His touch was warm and incredibly strong, sending an unexpected jolt through her weary body. "And you're not walking 3 miles in the freezing wind with a sick sister waiting at home. Come along." He guided her out of the store. The cold wind slapped her face, but for the first time in months, she didn't feel entirely exposed to the elements. Wyatt's wagon was hitched to a pair of massive, jet-black draft horses. The rig was sturdy, built for heavy freight, not a simple drifter's transport. He helped her up onto the wooden bench with respectful care, then climbed up beside her, taking the reins. The ride out of Oakhaven was quiet, save for the rhythmic clopping of hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels over the frozen, rutted mud. The silence stretched between them, thick with unasked questions. Abigail stole glances at his profile. Wyatt Callahan was a mystery. Drifters didn't carry pouches of gold, and wealthy men didn't dress in trail-worn canvas and faded denim. "Mr. Callahan," Abigail finally spoke, unable to bear the heavy silence. "Why did you do it? People in this town don't cross Amanda Montgomery, and they certainly don't stand up for the widow of Arthur Weston." Arthur. He was the foreman at the Blackwood silver mine. When the main shaft collapsed, 6 men died. The town blames him. They say he was cutting corners to hit a new vein. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his hands steady on the leather reins. People in towns like this usually believe whatever the loudest, richest man tells them to believe. "Josiah Blackwood," Abigail said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "He owns the mine, the bank, and half the town. He investigated his own mine collapse and placed the blame squarely on Arthur. Now, my husband is dead, his name is disgraced, and Josiah is trying to foreclose on our land. And what do you believe, Mrs. Weston?" Wyatt asked softly, finally turning his gray eyes to look at her. "I believe my husband was an honorable man," she said fiercely, her chin trembling. "He complained for weeks that the timber supports Josiah was buying were rotting. He begged him to halt production, but Arthur's journals disappeared the night of the cave-in. I have no proof. Only a ruined name and a farm I'm about to lose." Wyatt looked away, staring out over the barren, scrub-brush landscape of the Texas hill country. Sometimes, the truth takes a while to dig its way out of the dark, Mrs. Weston, but it usually finds the light eventually. They turned onto the weed-choked drive of the Weston farm. The homestead was a modest, whitewashed house that desperately needed paint. The fence was sagging, and the barn looked as though a strong gust of wind would topple it. It was a picture of defeat. Wyatt brought the horses to a halt. He jumped down and retrieved her supplies, carrying them straight to the front porch. Abigail hurried to open the door. The inside of the house was bitterly cold, the hearth holding nothing but dead gray ashes. From the back bedroom, a weak, raspy cough echoed through the thin walls. Abigail immediately rushed to the bedroom, finding 16-year-old Alexander shivering violently under a pile of thin quilts. "I have the quinine, sweetie," Abigail cooed, her heart breaking at the sight of her sister's pale, sweaty face. "Just hold on." When Abigail returned to the main room a few minutes later, she stopped in her tracks. Wyatt hadn't left. Instead, he was kneeling by the hearth. He had brought in an armful of chopped wood from the meager pile outside and was coaxing a roaring fire to life. The warmth began to radiate through the room, chasing away the bone-deep chill. He stood up, dusting off his knees. "The fire will hold for a few hours. I noticed your woodpile is getting low. I'll send a cord of oak up from town tomorrow." "Mr. Callahan, stop," Abigail said, stepping forward, overwhelmed by a mix of profound gratitude and terrifying vulnerability. "I cannot be your charity case. I don't know who you are or what you want from me." Wyatt stepped closer. He towered over her, but there was no menace in his posture, only a quiet, grounded strength. "I want absolutely nothing from you, Abigail. I bought the old Miller Ranch on the north boundary of your property. That makes us neighbors. And where I come from, neighbors don't let each other freeze to death. He touched the brim of his hat. I'll check on you and the girl tomorrow. Lock your doors. With that, he walked out into the cold, leaving Abigail standing in the warm glow of the fire, staring at the closed door, wondering if God had finally sent her an angel, or just a different kind of danger. 3 days passed, and Wyatt Callahan proved to be a man of his word. A heavy wagon laden with a cord of seasoned oak arrived the very next morning, driven by a hired hand who informed Abigail it was paid in full by Mr. Callahan. Alexander's fever broke on the second day, thanks to the quinine and the warmth of the fire. For the first time since Arthur's death, Abigail felt a tiny, fragile spark of hope kindling in her chest. She spent the mornings baking bread with the fresh flour Wyatt had bought, the smell of yeast and warm dough filling the small farmhouse. She told herself her fascination with the mysterious cowboy was merely gratitude. Yet, she found herself constantly looking out the kitchen window toward the north ridge, watching for the silhouette of a man in a canvas duster. On the afternoon of the fourth day, a carriage rattled up the driveway. Abigail's heart leaped, thinking it was Wyatt. But as she wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, the blood drained from her face. It wasn't a freight wagon. It was a polished black buggy with gold trim, and stepping out of it, wearing a tailored broadcloth suit and a silk cravat that mocked the dusty reality of Oakhaven, was Josiah Blackwood. Josiah was a man in his late 50s, stout and impeccably groomed, with silver hair and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He walked up the wooden steps of the porch with an air of absolute ownership, tapping his silver-tipped cane against the floorboards. "Afternoon, Abigail," Josiah said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I trust you and young Alexander are weathering the cold? State your business, Mr. Blackwood," Abigail said sharply, standing her ground in the doorway to block him from entering. "I have nothing to say to you," Josiah sighed, a patronizing sound. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded legal document. "Now, Abigail, there is no need for hostility. I am here as a friend and as a businessman. Your grace period on the mortgage expired 2 days ago. The grace period for the debt you claim my husband owed," she spat, her hands balling into fists. "A debt born from a tragedy you caused." Josiah's eyes narrowed, the friendly facade cracking just enough to show the venom beneath. "Arthur's negligence caused that collapse, Mrs. Weston. He was drinking. He ignored protocol. It was a tragedy, yes, but one of his own making. The Blackwood Company suffered terrible financial losses because of him. I am simply recouping what is rightfully mine. He never drank on the job. And you stole his journals to hide the truth about the rotten timbers," Abigail yelled, stepping forward. "Baseless accusations from a grief-stricken widow," Josiah said coldly, snapping the document open. "This is a formal notice of foreclosure. The sheriff will be here by the end of the week to evict you. However," Josiah paused, his eyes roaming over the property. "If you sign the deed over to me today, voluntarily, I will forgive the remaining debt and give you $50 to buy passage back east. It's more than generous." "You want this land," Abigail realized, her eyes widening as she looked at the worthless, scrubby acres. "Arthur told me weeks before he died. The new silver vein, it doesn't run under your mountain. It runs under my ridge." Josiah's jaw tightened, a flash of genuine anger crossing his face. "Sign the paper, Abigail, or you and your sister will freeze in the street." "She won't be signing a damn thing, Josiah." The voice cut through the frigid air like a bullwhip. Josiah spun around, nearly dropping his cane. Abigail gasped. Wyatt Callahan sat atop a massive bay stallion near the edge of the property line. He had ridden up so silently neither of them had heard him. Wyatt swung down from the saddle, his boots hitting the hard earth. He didn't walk. He stalked toward the porch, his slate-gray eyes locked on the banker. The air around him felt charged, thick with an undeniable, deadly intent. "Who the devil are you?" Josiah demanded, taking a step back as Wyatt approached the porch. "This is private business." Get off this land. I'm a neighbor, Wyatt said, stepping up onto the porch, placing himself directly between Abigail and Josiah. He loomed over the older man, and as I recall the law in this territory, a foreclosure requires a judge's signature, not just the blustering of a crooked banker. Josiah puffed up his chest, though his hands trembled slightly on his cane. You watch your mouth, boy. I own Oakhaven. I am Josiah Blackwood. I know exactly who you are, Wyatt said softly. The tone of his voice made the hairs on the back of Abigail's neck stand up. It wasn't just anger. It was a deeply personal, ancient hatred. Wyatt leaned in closer to Josiah, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that only Josiah and Abigail could hear. And I know exactly what happened in that mine. I know about the invoices for the cheap timber. I know about the safety inspector you bribed in Austin. Josiah's face went paper white. The smug arrogance completely evaporated, replaced by stark, naked terror. He stared into Wyatt's rugged face, his eyes frantically searching the younger man's features as if trying to place a ghost. How? Josiah choked out, gripping his cane with white knuckles. How could you possibly know that? The ledgers were burned. Not all of them, Wyatt said, a dangerous smirk playing on his lips. You always were sloppy when you thought no one was looking, Uncle. Abigail gasped, taking a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. Uncle? Josiah stumbled backward down the porch steps, nearly tripping over his own expensive boots. He pointed a trembling finger at Wyatt. It can't be. You've been gone for 10 years. You're dead. My brother said you died in Mexico. I survived, Wyatt replied coldly. And I spent a long time building my own fortune in the silver camps of Nevada. I bought the Miller Ranch under the name Callahan, but we both know my birthright, Wyatt Blackwood, and I've come back to take everything you stole from this town, starting with Arthur Weston's reputation. Josiah looked from Wyatt's steely gaze to the fierce shock on Abigail's face. Without another word, the powerful banker scrambled into his buggy, whipping the horses into a frantic gallop back toward town, kicking up a cloud of frozen dust. Silence descended on the farmhouse porch. The wind howled through the eaves. Abigail stared at the broad back of the man who had just saved her, her mind reeling. He wasn't just a drifter. He wasn't just a cowboy with a heart of gold. He was a Blackwood. The blood of the man who ruined her life ran through his veins. Wyatt turned slowly to face her. The hard, dangerous edge had vanished from his eyes, replaced by a deep, weary regret. He took off his hat, clutching it in his hands. Abigail, he started, his voice thick with emotion. I should have told you. You're a Blackwood, she whispered, the betrayal stinging sharper than the winter wind. You're one of them. I share his blood, but not his soul, Wyatt pleaded, taking a cautious step toward her. When I heard what my uncle did to your husband to cover up his own greed, I came back to ruin him. I bought the ranch next door to protect you while I gathered the evidence to hang him. Protect me? Abigail's voice broke. Tears of confusion and anger spilled down her cheeks. You lied to me. You let me accept your charity under false pretenses. I gave you exactly what I said I would, Wyatt said firmly, closing the distance between them. He didn't touch her, but his presence surrounded her. Warm and undeniable. I gave you my help, asking for nothing in return. My name doesn't change what I did at the store, and it doesn't change the fact that I am going to make sure Josiah pays for Arthur's death, and for every tear you've shed. Abigail looked up into his slate-gray eyes. The walls she had built around her heart were crumbling. The town of Oakhaven was about to be torn apart in a war between two Blackwoods, and she was standing right in the center of the battlefield. The biting Texas wind rattled the loose window panes of the Weston farmhouse, but the chill inside Abigail's heart was far more profound. She stood by the hearth, watching the flames devour the oak logs Wyatt had provided, wrestling with a bitter tempest of emotions. The man who had pulled her from the depths of despair, who had defied Amanda Montgomery with 7 simple words and a pouch of gold, carried the very name that had destroyed her life. Blackwood. For 3 days following Josiah's hasty retreat, Wyatt did not set foot on her property. He respected the boundary of her anger, leaving only fresh milk and a plucked chicken at the edge of the property line before dawn, riding away before she could even open the door. It was a silent, agonizing penance. It was Alexander who finally broke the stalemate. Pale but steadily regaining the color in her cheeks, the 16-year-old sat at the wooden kitchen table, wrapping a woolen shawl tightly around her thin shoulders. "You're punishing him for the sins of his uncle, Abby," Alexander observed quietly, sipping a cup of hot broth. Abigail paused, a heavy cast-iron skillet trembling in her grip. "He lied to me, Alexander. He came into my life under a false name. How can I trust a man whose very blood is tied to Josiah Blackwood? Josiah killed Arthur. He ruined our name. And Wyatt saved my life," Alexander replied softly, her young eyes holding a wisdom born of too much hardship. "He didn't have to pay Amanda Montgomery. He didn't have to buy us firewood or medicine. If he was anything like Josiah, he would have let us freeze and bought the land at auction for pennies. You know, Arthur would have judged the man, not the name." The mention of Arthur brought a fresh sting of tears to Abigail's eyes. Arthur had been a fair man, a man who dug through the dirt to find the pure silver beneath. She set the skillet down, untied her flour-stained apron, and grabbed her heavy winter coat. She walked the 1.5 miles to the old Miller ranch, her boots crunching through the frost-heaved mud. The property had been abandoned for years, but Wyatt had already begun to breathe life back into it. The corral fences were mended, and smoke billowed cheerfully from the stone chimney. Wyatt was in the barn, his broad back flexing beneath a simple cotton work shirt as he hoisted a saddle onto the massive bay stallion. He froze the moment he heard her footsteps, turning slowly. The guarded, haunted look was back in his slate-gray eyes. "Mrs. Weston," he said, his voice a low, cautious rumble. "You told Josiah you were dead for 10 years, Abigail said, skipping any pleasantries. She stood in the doorway, the cold wind whipping her dark hair around her face. "You said you survived." "Survived what, exactly?" Wyatt sighed, running a calloused hand through his dark hair. He stepped out of the horse's stall, leaning against a sturdy wooden post. "My father, Elias, built the Blackwood Mining Company. He was a hard man, but an honest one. When I was 19, he fell ill. Suddenly, Josiah took over the accounts. 2 weeks later, my father was dead, and Josiah produced a newly forged will leaving everything to him." Abigail listened, her heart aching against her will at the raw, unresolved grief in Wyatt's voice. "I challenged it," Wyatt continued, his jaw tightening. "I told Josiah I was taking the ledgers to Judge Phineas T. Caldwell in Austin, but I never made it. Josiah hired 3 gunmen to ambush me near the Sonora border. They shot me twice in the chest and left me for the buzzards." He unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of his shirt, revealing a thick, jagged pair of scars cutting across his collarbone. "A Mexican family found me. It took me 2 years just to walk right again. I spent the next 8 years in the Nevada silver camps, digging with my bare hands, building a fortune of my own so I could come back and bury Josiah under the weight of his own greed." Abigail stepped fully into the barn, the scent of hay and leather surrounding her. "And Arthur? Why involve yourself with my husband's tragedy?" "Because Arthur Weston was a good foreman," Wyatt said fiercely. "I had men keeping an ear to the ground in Oak Haven for years. I knew Josiah was cutting corners, buying rotting yellow pine from Hiram Dalton's lumberyard instead of proper reinforced timber. When the shaft collapsed, I knew Josiah had murdered those men just to save a few dollars, and I knew he would try to steal your land because the main silver vein shifted east, right under your ridge. But he burned the company ledgers to hide the timber purchases," Abigail whispered, the pieces finally clicking together. "Without proof, the sheriff will never arrest a man as powerful as Josiah." "I know," Wyatt said, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I thought I could force him into a confession, but Josiah is a cornered rat now. He'll strike back." Abigail's breath hitched. A sudden, sharp memory pierced through her mind, a memory of Arthur, just 3 nights before the collapse. He had come home late, his face coated in coal dust and a frantic, nervous energy radiating from his bones. He hadn't spoken a word. He had simply gone to the heavy oak floorboards beneath their bed, prying one loose with an iron crowbar, sliding a thick, leather-bound book into the dark space beneath. "Wyatt," Abigail breathed, her eyes widening in sudden realization. Arthur. Arthur wasn't a fool. He knew Josiah was trying to silence him. Wyatt stepped forward, the space between them evaporating. "Abigail, what are you saying?" "Arthur kept his own private foreman's ledger," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I saw him hide something beneath the floorboards of our bedroom. If it's the duplicate ledger, it will have Josiah's signature on the orders for the rotting timber." A dangerous, predatory light ignited in Wyatt's eyes. "Then we need to tear up those floorboards right now." The sun had already dipped beneath the jagged horizon, casting the Texas hill country into a deep, bruised twilight by the time Wyatt and Abigail returned to the Weston farm. The wind had died down, replaced by an eerie, suffocating stillness. Inside the house, Alexander held an oil lantern steady as Wyatt drove the iron edge of a crowbar into the seam of the oak floorboards beneath Abigail's bed. With a sharp crack, the ancient nails gave way. Wyatt reached his arm into the dusty darkness between the joists. For a terrifying second, his hand found nothing but cobwebs. Then, his fingers brushed against cold, heavy leather. He pulled it out. It was a thick, black journal, the edges stained with sweat and mine dust. On the cover, embossed in fading gold, were the initials A.W. Abigail dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she took the book from Wyatt. She opened it to the final pages. There, in Arthur's precise, looping handwriting, were the damning records. October 12th. Ordered 400 linear feet of reinforced oak timber. Order denied by Josiah Blackwood. October 15th. Delivery received. 400 feet of cheap, untreated yellow pine from Hiram Dalton. Wood is damp and showing signs of dry rot, I protested. Josiah threatened my job. He signed the intake manifest himself. I have pinned the duplicate manifest to this page. There it was, a crisp, yellowed piece of paper, bearing the unmistakable, arrogant signature of Josiah Blackwood, proving he knowingly sent 6 men into a death trap. "We have him," Wyatt whispered, a profound sense of vindication washing over his rugged face. He looked at Abigail, his gray eyes softening. "You did it, Abigail. You've cleared Arthur's name." Tears spilled freely down Abigail's cheeks, a crushing weight lifting from her chest. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that justice was possible. She looked up at Wyatt, the resentment completely gone, replaced by a fierce, undeniable gratitude, and something deeper, something that felt terrifyingly like hope. But the moment of triumph was shattered by the frantic barking of the stray dog Abigail kept in the barn. Wyatt's head snapped toward the window. The stillness of the night was broken by the rhythmic, heavy thud of approaching horses, not 1 or 2, but at least a half-dozen. "Blow out the lantern," Wyatt ordered, his voice instantly dropping into a deadly, commanding whisper. Alexander immediately snuffed the flame, plunging the room into darkness. Wyatt moved with terrifying speed, drawing a heavy Colt .45 revolver from the holster at his hip. He crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just a fraction of an inch. Through the warped glass, Abigail saw the flicker of orange light cresting the ridge. It was 5 men on horseback, holding blazing pitch pine torches. At the front of the pack rode Judd McCall, Josiah's ruthless new foreman, a man known for breaking strikes with brass knuckles and a sawed-off shotgun. "Josiah isn't waiting for the sheriff or a judge," Wyatt said grimly, pulling Abigail back from the glass. "He knows I'm here. He knows what I'm looking for. They've come to burn the house to the ground with us inside." "No," Abigail gasped, panic surging as Alexander gripped her arm in the dark. "Abigail, listen to me," Wyatt said, gripping her shoulders. His touch was an anchor in the sudden chaos. "Take Alexander. Go out the back door and run to the root cellar behind the barn. Hide under the burlap sacks and do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." I am not leaving you to fight 5 armed men alone, Abigail hissed, her fear suddenly eclipsed by a fierce, protective instinct she didn't know she possessed. She reached under the bed and pulled out Arthur's old Winchester repeating rifle. I know how to shoot, Wyatt. Arthur taught me. Wyatt stared at her in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. For a fleeting second, a reckless, admiring smile touched his lips. You are an incredibly stubborn woman, Abigail Weston. And you are a stubborn man, she replied, jacking around into the chamber of the Winchester. Now tell me what to do. A glass window shattered in the front parlor, followed immediately by the heavy thud of a lit torch hitting the wooden floorboards. The dry, braided rug instantly caught fire, casting a frantic, dancing orange glow through the house. Burn 'em out! Judd McCall's voice roared from the front yard. Mr. Blackwood, once the ashes sifted by morning. Alexander, the cellar, now, Abigail ordered. Her sister didn't argue. She grabbed her shawl and slipped out the back kitchen door, disappearing into the night. Wyatt kicked open the front door, stepping onto the porch with his Colt raised. The blast of his revolver was deafening in the tight space. The man nearest the porch, holding a bottle of kerosene, dropped like a stone, clutching his shoulder. It's the Blackwood boy, another rider shouted, his horse rearing in panic at the gunfire. Abigail stepped to the broken parlor window, resting the heavy barrel of the Winchester on the sill. She leveled the sights on Judd McCall, her hands remarkably steady despite the terror thrumming in her veins. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The bullet took Judd McCall's hat clean off his head, missing his skull by a fraction of an inch. The ruthless foreman shouted in shock, dropping his torch and frantically pulling his horse back into the shadows. Return fire, McCall screamed from the darkness. Bullets tore through the thin wooden walls of the farmhouse. Wood splintered, sending deadly shards flying through the air. Wyatt ducked back inside, tackling Abigail to the floor just as a slug shattered the mirror on the far wall. They lay pressed together on the floorboards as the gunfire rained down around them. The fire from the parlor was spreading, the smoke growing thick and choking. Wyatt's heavy chest pressed against Abigail's back. She could feel his heart hammering in time with her own. We can't stay in here, Wyatt shouted over the roar of the flames and the cracking of gunfire. The roof is going to go. The back door. Abigail choked out, coughing against the acrid black smoke. Wyatt grabbed her hand, his grip iron tight. They crawled on their bellies through the smoke-filled kitchen. Wyatt kicked the back door open, pulling her out into the freezing night air. They scrambled behind the thick, stone basin of the water well just as a volley of bullets chewed up the dirt where they had just been. They've got us pinned down, Wyatt grunted, quickly reloading his Colt in the darkness. He looked at Abigail, his face smeared with soot, his gray eyes blazing with an intensity that took her breath away. If we don't make it to the barn, they'll flank us, Wyatt said, his voice deadly serious. He reached out, his soot-stained hand gently cupping her face. It was an intimate, desperate gesture amidst the violence. I am not going to let them hurt you, Abigail. Do you hear me? I came back to this town for revenge, but right now, you are the only thing that matters. Before she could respond, Wyatt leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, romantic kiss. It was fierce, desperate, and tasted of smoke, dust, and raw survival. It was a promise forged in fire. Abigail kissed him back, pouring all her fear, her grief, and her newfound fire into the embrace. Her hands gripping the canvas of his duster. Wyatt broke the kiss, his eyes locked on hers. When I start shooting, you run for the barn. Don't look back. Without waiting for her argument, Wyatt stood up from behind the stone well, stepping out into the open moonlight, raising his revolver and roaring into the night, drawing every ounce of the killer's attention onto himself. The night erupted into a deafening roar of gunpowder and splintering wood. Wyatt Callahan did not just step into the moonlight, he commanded it. He fanned the hammer of his Colt, .45, with a blistering, fluid speed born of his brutal years in the Nevada silver camps. 2 of Josiah's hired guns were thrown from their saddles before they even realized the man they were supposed to burn out was shooting back. Abigail didn't hesitate. With Wyatt drawing every ounce of Judd McCall's murderous attention, she hiked up her heavy skirts, clutched Arthur's Winchester to her chest, and sprinted for the barn. "Take him down," McCall bellowed over the frantic whinnying of panicked horses. "Shoot him to pieces." Bullets kicked up geysers of frozen mud at Wyatt's boots. He dove behind the rusted iron chassis of an old plow, his revolver clicking empty. As he scrambled to reload, a Winchester round from one of the riders tore through the fleshy part of his upper left arm. Wyatt grunted, the impact spinning him hard against the cold iron, blood instantly soaking the canvas of his duster. From the dark, gaping maw of the barn doors, Abigail saw him fall. A primal, terrifying scream tore from her throat, but she swallowed it down. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She scrambled up the wooden rungs to the hayloft, the scent of dry alfalfa and fear thick in her nostrils. She threw herself onto her stomach near the loft doors, resting the heavy barrel of the Winchester on a rotting crossbeam. Down in the yard, McCall had dismounted. He drew a sawed-off shotgun, stalking slowly toward the plow where Wyatt was pinned. The farmhouse behind them was now a towering inferno, casting a hellish, flickering orange light over the property. "It's over, Blackwood," McCall sneered, racking the shotgun. "Your uncle sends his regards." Abigail closed her left eye. She steadied her breathing, just as Arthur had taught her when they hunted coyotes on the ridge. She centered the iron sights squarely on the center of Judd McCall's chest. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle boomed in the confined space of the loft. McCall screamed as the bullet shattered his collarbone, the sheer force of the Winchester round throwing him backward into the mud. His shotgun discharged harmlessly into the night sky. The two remaining riders, seeing their ruthless foreman go down and realizing they were caught in a deadly crossfire, lost their nerve. They spurred their horses, dragging a bleeding McCall up by his gun belt and galloping blindly into the darkness toward Oakhaven. Silence rushed back onto the farm, save for the crackling, monstrous roar of the burning house. Abigail dropped the rifle and scrambled down the ladder, tearing across the yard toward the plow. Wyatt was already staggering to his feet, his right hand clutching his bleeding left arm. His face was pale beneath the soot, but his gray eyes were bright with a fierce, adrenaline-fueled relief as she slammed into his chest. "You're shot," Abigail gasped, her hands hovering frantically over the dark stain on his sleeve. Through and through, Wyatt gritted out, wincing as he pressed his hand harder against the wound. It missed the bone. "I've had worse from a green-broke Mustang." He looked up at the loft, then down at her, a breathless chuckle escaping his lips. "Remind me never to make you angry, Mrs. Weston." Alexander emerged cautiously from the shadows of the root cellar, her eyes wide with terror as she took in the sight of their home. The roof of the farmhouse groaned, then collapsed inward with a sickening crash, sending a massive plume of sparks spiraling into the Texas night. Everything Abigail owned, her wedding quilt, the wooden cradle Arthur had begun carving. Her mother's china was turning to ash. But as she stood in the freezing mud, Wyatt's strong, uninjured arm wrapping protectively around her shoulders, she realized she had never felt more alive. Clutched tightly in Alexander's hands, safe from the flames, was Arthur's black leather ledger. "We need to bind that arm," Abigail said, her voice shaking but resolute. "And then we are going to town. We are not waiting for morning. We are finishing this tonight." Dawn had not yet broken over Oakhaven, but the town was far from asleep. Across the glow of the fire on the ridge had drawn townsfolk out onto the wooden boardwalks. Amanda Montgomery stood outside his general store, a woolen blanket wrapped around his shoulders, watching the orange hue on the horizon with a knot of dread in his stomach. Inside the opulent, gas-lit parlor of the Blackwood Bank, Josiah Blackwood paced furiously. He poured himself a crystal glass of expensive bourbon, his hands trembling. Judd McCall had returned an hour ago, bleeding and half-conscious, babbling about Wyatt Blackwood fighting like a demon and a sharpshooter in the barn. "Fools. Incompetent fools," Josiah muttered to himself, downing the bourbon. He would have to forge a bill of sale immediately. He would claim the Westons perished in an accidental fire, a tragic end to a tragic family. He reached for his gold-nibbed pen. The heavy, oak front doors of the bank did not just open. They were kicked off their brass hinges. Josiah jumped, dropping his glass. It shattered on the Persian rug. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the pale, pre-dawn light, was Wyatt Callahan. His canvas duster was scorched and stained with blood. His left arm was tightly bound with a torn, soot-stained petticoat, but his right hand rested comfortably on the worn walnut grip of his Colt. Beside him stood Abigail Weston. Her face was streaked with ash, her skirts ruined, but she held her head with a terrifying, regal defiance. And in her hands, she held a thick, black, leather book. "Good God," Josiah breathed, backing away until his spine hit his mahogany desk. The commotion had drawn a crowd. Townsfolk, including Amanda Montgomery and the gossiping Mrs. Gable, began to peer through the shattered bank doors, murmuring in shock. But Wyatt and Abigail hadn't come alone. Stepping out from behind them was a man whose presence made the blood drain entirely from Josiah's face. He wore a crisp, dark suit, a silver star pinned to his lapel, and carried the quiet, lethal authority of the state. "Josiah Blackwood," the man said, his voice a calm, carrying drawl. "I am Texas Ranger Corporal Ira Otten. I was down in San Saba dealing with wire cutters when I received a telegram from a Mr. Callahan regarding corporate fraud and attempted murder in Oakhaven. Seems I arrived just in time to witness the aftermath." "Ranger Ayton," Josiah stammered, wiping sweat from his brow. "This is a misunderstanding. These people are trespassers. That man is an imposter." "The only imposter here is you, Uncle," Wyatt said, stepping fully into the gaslight. The murmurs from the crowd outside erupted into loud gasps. Wyatt Blackwood, the dead heir, had returned. Abigail stepped forward, her eyes locking onto the man who had ordered her husband's death. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. Her voice was pure, tempered steel. "3 months ago, you stood in the town square and told these people my husband was a drunk. You said his negligence killed 6 good men." Abigail lifted the black ledger, slamming it down onto Josiah's immaculate mahogany desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "This is Arthur Weston's personal foreman's log. It contains the duplicate manifests for the rotting pine timber you forced him to use, complete with your signature. You killed those men to save a few dollars, Josiah, and you tried to burn my sister and me alive tonight to cover it up." Ranger Ayton stepped up to the desk, opening the ledger. He adjusted his spectacles, reading Arthur's meticulous handwriting and examining the pinned manifest. The ranger looked up, his face hardening into a mask of disgust. "Josiah Blackwood," Ranger Ayton said, drawing a pair of heavy iron cuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for the murders of the 6 miners at the Blackwood Silver Mine, the attempted murder of Abigail and Alexander Weston, and the attempted murder of your own nephew, Wyatt Blackwood. You can't do this." Josiah shrieked, struggling as the ranger pinned him roughly against the desk and locked the iron cuffs around his wrists. "I own this town. I am a man of substance." "You own nothing," Wyatt said quietly, his slate-gray eyes devoid of pity. "The mining company reverts to me as the rightful heir. And the first thing I'm doing is dissolving it. The land goes back to the families you stole it from." As Ranger Ayton dragged a sobbing, broken Josiah Blackwood out of the bank and into the street, the townsfolk parted in stunned silence. Amanda Montgomery looked at Abigail, shame reddening his face, and quickly removed his hat, bowing his head in profound apology. The whispers that had once condemned her now carried nothing but awe. The sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light through the shattered doors of the bank. Wyatt turned to Abigail. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. But when he looked at her, his rugged face softened into a look of profound, unconditional devotion. "The farm is gone," Wyatt said softly, reaching out with his uninjured arm to brush a streak of soot from her cheek. "I am so sorry, Abigail." "It was just a house," Abigail replied, leaning into his touch, the warmth of his hand anchoring her. "You said you bought the Miller Ranch. That makes us neighbors," Wyatt smiled, that rare, devastating smile that reached his eyes. "I think we can do better than neighbors, Abigail, if you'll have me. We have a lot of rebuilding to do. Then we'd best get started, she whispered, pulling him down by the lapels of his ruined duster to press her lips to his. In the center of the town that had tried to break her, Abigail Weston finally found her home, forged in fire and bound by a love that no man could ever steal. The ashes of the Weston farm eventually washed away in the spring rains, but the legacy of that fateful winter night in 1888 became a legend whispered across the Texas hill country. What began with a cruel humiliation and 7 defiant words at a general store counter ignited a fierce battle for truth. Tearing down an empire built on greed and betrayal, Abigail Weston transformed from a desperate, grieving widow into a woman of unbreakable iron, clearing her husband's name and securing justice for the fallen. Beside her stood Wyatt, a man who abandoned his ghosts to become her fiercest protector. Together, they rebuilt the Miller Ranch, their love a testament to survival and resilience. In the unforgiving frontier, they proved that while the past might leave deep scars, it is the fire we walk through that ultimately forges our truest destiny.